the police contacted him because he'd retweeted a poem that was deemed to be transphobic by one member of the public. Because he was saying, have I committed a crime? They said, no. And he said, well, if I haven't committed a crime, why are you here? And they said, we need to check your thinking. And of course, that's, if you were writing a play about a state descending into an Orwellian version of itself, that's the kind of phrase
that would be
you'd come
too
up
on
with.
the nose,
But you wouldn't believe it, would you? Right?
Presumably there are some instances in which you would be in favour of curtailing speech.
No, there would be instances in which I would be in favour of punishing people for committing crimes using the mechanism of speech, which is not quite the same thing. Scottish police have a database of jokes that they've seen online. They don't tell the people that they're recording it. They just write down the name of the person who's said the joke, and they keep a watch on them. Beyond the definitional issues of the term hate, there is the ethical issue of, should the state be auditing our emotions anyway? Why is it wrong to hate? Why shouldn't we be able to do so legally?
Welcome to Within Reason. My name is Alex O'Connor. Andrew Doyle is a playwright, journalist, political commentator, and satirist. He's the creator of Titania McGrath, a parody of an ultra-woke militant Twitter warrior. He's also co-written for the fictional newsreader Jonathan Pye. He's the author of Free Speech and Why It Matters, and he joins me today to talk about his most recent book, The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. And this episode of Within Reason is brought to you by Atlas VPN. Everybody knows how important internet security is, but you may not know just how easy it is to protect yourself against hackers and big tech. When you turn on Atlas VPN, your IP address is masked and your data is rerouted through a separate server somewhere else in the world. This means not only that your data is protected against being tracked, but also you can appear as though you are anywhere in the world. This means that you can access content that's usually restricted by region online, and you can even save money when booking things like flights and hotels by buying them, virtually speaking, from somewhere else in the world, where sometimes they can be cheaper. Atlas VPN also blocks malicious links, ads, and trackers, and even notifies you when it detects somebody trying to steal your data. And you can protect an unlimited number of devices from just a single subscription. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a summer sale. You can get a premium subscription for just $1.83 per month, and 3 months extra if you get a 3-year plan. Not only this, but there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. All you have to do is go to get.atlasvpn.com/Alex or click the link in the top of the description and get your membership today. With that said, here's Andrew Doyle. Andrew Doyle, thank you for coming.
Alex O'Connor, thank you for having me.
It's an interesting title, The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World, your latest book.
Yes.
What are the New Puritans?
Well, when I posted the original image of the front cover of that, I got a lot of angry Christians saying, why are you slagging off the Puritans, etc. It's not about them. It's really not about them. The phrase, the New Puritans, is just a kind of shorthand to try and describe the adherence to this ideological movement that we're all pretty familiar with. It comes in many guises. People colloquially call it the woke movement. I tend to favour the phrase critical social justice. But there's all sorts of ways, leftist identitarianism, all these sort of phrases. So we all know what we're talking about. But the reason why I wanted to find a simple shorthand like the New Puritans is because it resonates, I think, with the kind of the moral purity that the disciples of this new faith demand of others. So it sort of encapsulates that. On a sort of popular culture level, lots of people are familiar with, elements of old comedy shows being cut out, or demands for films to be censored, or for plays to be censored, or for trigger warnings to be applied for books. All of that kind of feels what we would colloquially term puritanical, even though it's not really accurate historically. But it's a nice sort of shorthand. And also I kind of felt that I was okay to do this because the term Puritan predates the way in which we use it historically. Anyway, it was kind of applied to these people as a kind of term of abuse to connote this idea of a purity, demands for purity. So I think it works in that regard. But also, as you'll know, I don't know if you've managed to read the book, but you'll know that I start and end the book with Salem.
Yes. And
the reason for that is I find a lot of parallels between what happened in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 17th century and what is occurring now with this ideology, which I see as a kind of a form of hysteria. So it is an allusion to the Puritans of New England in that respect, but I'm quite careful in the book to explain why they are not the same thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, the comparison to the Salem witch trials is interesting because, of course, the Salem witch trials, I don't think they're sort of maybe as dramatic as many people assume that they were.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you can give us a little bit of the history.
That's probably right, because we all think of The Crucible, Arthur Miller's play, and we have these images of scores of people being hanged for being accused of witch, and in fact it was only 20 were executed. I mean that's terrible enough, right? 20 people executed, a further 5 died in prison. But it's not like the medieval witch hunts in Europe where thousands of people were killed. It's a different kettle of fish. The Puritans of New England were not witch hunters. They didn't go around doing this. This was an aberration. But that's also why I think it's a good comparison to make, because they were decent, God-fearing people. They all repented afterwards. They thought this was a terrible situation. I mean, I'm speaking as though people know, but maybe they don't. But just to explain, it was late 17th century, lasted a little over a year. I think it was from February 1692 to May 1693. All of a sudden, the girls in the village of Salem started saying that they could see witches, or that they'd seen people within the village with witches, or signing the devil's book, or doing that kind of thing. It was instigated by a girl called Abigail Williams. And soon there was a kind of cohort of young girls screaming witch. And there were trials, and there were magistrates, and there were ministers descending on the town. And these girls suddenly accrued incredible power. They had the power of life and death all of a sudden over anyone in the village. And anyone who challenged them or said, this isn't really happening, they accused them next. A very good example is a woman called Rebecca Nurse, whose house is still extant in Salem, one of the few that is. And she was one of the most upstanding, popular, deeply religious women of the town. But she cast aspersions on what they were doing. She was suggesting this is a silly season, which I think is the phrase that Arthur Miller uses in The Crucible. And so they said she was a witch, and they hanged her. Now, the reason why I compare that to what's happening now is, and draw comparisons with what we colloquially call cancel culture, is that I think it is largely maintained. I mean, no one's getting hanged, right? But they are having their reputations ruined, their jobs destroyed. There's a lot at stake because of accusations that are not evidence-based. So whereas the girls would shout witch, a modern-day equivalent would shout TERF, or racist, homophobe, fascist, Nazi, all of these slurs that we see endlessly bandied about. And we've reached a point where the accusation is taken as proof. That's similar as to what happened in Salem. Similarly, all of the prosecutions in Salem were secured on what they called spectral evidence. Now, I talk about this in the book because I see a clear comparison between spectral evidence, in other words, I, the accuser, see this thing and interpret it in this way, and therefore that is evidence of what I am saying. We call that lived experience. You hear that phrase, lived experience, all the time. This is my lived experience. This is how I've perceived this event. I have perceived that the way that you have interacted with me comes from a homophobic stance, and therefore that is sufficient evidence for something to occur as a result, or for you to be penalized in some way. So I was trying to draw those sorts of comparisons, but chiefly, sorry, I know I'm rambling, but just chiefly, I think the reason why it bears and merits a sort of analogy is that Salem only really happened because of the people in authority, the magistrates and the ministers capitulating to what the girls were saying. Had all of those people in authority said, no, this isn't real, you're not seeing the devil, this is all either a hysterical fantasy or some sort of retributive measure that you're taking, then it would have gone away. It wouldn't have mattered how much the girls screamed witch. And I see that very much today. I don't care about all the activists online who scream at me and call me a Nazi and fascist and all the rest of it, and make accusations against people. It's the people in authority, the politicians, the commentariat, the police, etc., who truckle to their bidding and say, we're going to believe this, right? So all of these screaming activists would go away. But they have somehow, over the past 12 years maximum, cultivated incredible clout within our society. They occupy major positions of influence in all of our major institutions, civic institutions, public institutions, the law, the judiciary, the police, schools certainly, higher education most definitely. That's where a lot of it comes from. And they can be vicious, and they can seek to attack and demean anyone who dissents from their point of view, or more importantly, anyone who challenges their worldview. And if the people in authority just said, come on, this is hysteria, we're not going along with it, I think it would dissipate, but they don't. And in Salem, the consequences of that were 20 dead. Today, the consequences of that are a climate of generalized fear amongst the population about what should or should not be said or how things will be interpreted, and what we call cancel culture, which, for all I hear that it doesn't exist, it has managed to pile up a hell of a lot of casualties, which would suggest that it does.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot to unpack there. I think the cancel culture thing is interesting in that a lot of people have... I remember once doing a debate for the Oxford Union about cancel culture, and it was this house would cancel culture or similarly cliche.
Yeah.
And there was this point made that, well, look at the people who are supposedly cancelled. Someone like J.K. Rowling, for example. She's doing okay. She's still making money. She's still publishing books. No problem. Like, cancel culture isn't that bad of a thing. And my observation was to say, I'm less worried about cancel culture in terms of how much success it's had, but what people want it to do. That is, if the forerunners of the people who wanted to cancel J.K. Rowling got their way, would she be publishing books? Would she be making money from this material?
Right.
I think the answer might be no, and I think the intention is potentially more important there in terms of what there is to be worried about when we talk about this nebulous cancel culture. Is it what's actually happening, or is it about the motivations of the people?
I mean, we already know the answer to your theoretical or your hypothetical question, because there is the example of Gillian Phillip, who is the children's author who merely tweeted in favor of J.K. Rowling, just to put a hashtag, I stand with J.K. Rowling, was dropped by her publisher, by her agent, had to retrain as a truck driver, had to leave the children's book industry entirely because of the extent of abuse and approbation she received. And of course, that's because she's not an established author in the way that J.K. Rowling was. Not that she wasn't established, she was doing pretty well,
right?
But she wasn't quite at that status. You're absolutely right. You cannot cancel the likes of J.K. Rowling and Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle. They are hugely popular. J.K. Rowling's books, as far as I understand it, are selling better than ever. Now, but people will point to that and say, well, that's evidence that cancel culture doesn't exist. But it isn't, because no one has made the claim that J.K. Rowling has been cancelled. The attacks on J.K. Rowling, the continual death threats and rape threats that come daily, to the extent that she says she could paper the house with them, this is, I suppose, possibly a kind of signal to others to say, don't stray out of line, because this is what we do to her. We can't cancel her. But look at the way that we treat other people, right? So there are so many examples, and you'll know from the book that I provide numerous examples of people who have been what we call cancelled, people who have lost their livelihoods and their jobs. And the key shared characteristic is they are not very famous or very established. The true victims of cancel culture are normal people, aren't celebrities. The problem with it is, of course, is that we largely hear about the celebrities because those are the examples that make the media. So it's so much more common than people realize. Helen Pluckrose set up a group called Counterweight in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, and the purpose of this group was that there were so many people sort of saying, oh my goodness, at work all of a sudden I'm having to attend unconscious bias training sessions. I'm being told that I'm racist when I'm not. I'm being told to confess my whiteness and my prejudice, etc. And I've pushed back at it, and now I'm about to lose my job. Now I'm about to be fired. Not exclusively white people either, by the way. There were ethnic minority people coming to Helen saying, my boss dragged me in the office and said, tell me how you're oppressed. And I've said, I'm not oppressed. And they've said, well, that's a sign of your oppression, and almost penalize the people for making that point. Now, none of these stories will come out. It would be disadvantageous to the people themselves for it to come out. Helen set up this group, which unfortunately has now fallen by the wayside, but it was there to help them, guide them through this, to support them legally. The Free Speech Union does a similar thing. There have been, when the Free Speech Union started, they were subject to all kinds of scoffing, I'd call it. Just people saying there's no need for this is an imaginary enemy you're fighting. But they've been vindicated again and again, and they've saved so many people's careers. And again, it's not celebrities, it's not Hollywood stars. Those aren't the people I'm worried about. Not that I'm saying it's right to send a horrible threat to a Hollywood star. They're still a human being. But the point is, they can't be cancelled in the way that most of us can. If I was still a teacher, I would almost certainly not be able to do that anymore, right? So I think there's a misunderstanding about what cancel culture is. And when people say it's not really cancelling anyone, it's just, we call it accountability culture. Well, then you're into the realm of, well, what do you mean? What is deserving of accountability? Is the statement, men and women are different, and we have to organise society with the recognition of those differences? Is it therefore justifiable to send that individual death and rape threats? Is that sufficient accountability? Or to contact their employer and demand that they be fired, to make their life hell, to bombard them on social media, to monster them publicly, to make their lives hell for no other reason than you disagree with their point of view? That, to me, is the opposite of accountability.
Yeah, I mean, the golden rule of accountability, the golden rule of punishment is that the punishment must be proportionate to the crime. And
that's the key thing of cancel culture.
Yeah.
It's largely disproportionate. In the vast majority of cases, it isn't just horrible people saying horrible things and getting their comeuppance. I mean, I'm all for that. If I go online and say some horrible racist thing, I deserve to be robustly criticized, even to become the subject of abuse, I think. But that's different from me making an innocuous comment, expressing an opinion that 99% of the country believe in, and then having people attack me for it.
Well, not just that, but even if you say something genuinely horrendous, the punishment still needs to be proportionate.
It does,
and,
absolutely.
And the power of social media is essentially unchecked and unexplored. I mean, I've described it before as something like the ability to take a nuclear bomb and drop it on a single individual.
Right.
And we've made precisely no effort to figure out how to manage that. I think the most difficult thing to answer for a person in our broad position of being pro-free speech and sort of suspicious of this whole cancel culture, whatever that may be, is to talk about social media companies. Is to say it's quite straightforward with governments when we say that governments aren't able to intervene with free speech. I mean, there's still some...
They do.
There are still some things to iron out there. Even in principle, it's difficult to know exactly what that means. I spoke to Konstantin Kisin on this podcast about libel laws and copyright laws, and in principle, what the justifications for those are that don't also apply to things like hate speech laws.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd be interested to hear your views on that. I mean, your previous book was Free Speech and Why It Matters. You wrote an entire book about free speech, and you're known for being very pro-free speech, but presumably there are some instances in which you would be in favor of curtailing speech.
No, there would be instances in which I would be in favor of punishing people for committing crimes using the mechanism of speech, which is not quite the same thing. If you commit espionage, say, or perjury. Perjury is a good example.
Yeah.
Now, when you are imprisoned for perjury, you're not being imprisoned for your choices, the speech choices that you've made. You're being imprisoned for committing perjury. It just so happens that it has been enacted through the means of speech, and that's the distinction I would make. And the same could be said of libel. The same could be said of blackmail.
Yes.
So that's a distinction that I think it should be very clearly drawn. When free speech advocates are saying we are absolutists, they're not saying we believe, therefore, you should be able to commit crime that involves speech. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, presumably in a situation where somebody were about to commit libel and you had the ability to prevent that, or the government had the ability to prevent that, then there might be some justification in essentially preventing speech. I mean, I like the way that you've put it, that you don't want to prevent speech, you want to punish criminal behavior through the mechanism of speech. But surely in at least some cases this manifests as curtailing a person's ability to say particular things.
Well, it depends. I mean, libel's a very specific example, because in order to prove libel, you'd have to prove intent.
That's right.
You would have to prove that this person maliciously said something false about you in order that there be some ramifications, a loss of income, say, a shattering of one's reputation. And of course, if that is achieved, lives can be ruined, and it's perfectly fair for the victim of that to seek recompense. Maybe libel's one of those examples where it should go through civil action rather than through law courts.
Right. I'm interested in this distinction you've made between curtailing speech and punishing crimes committed through the mechanism of speech. I mean, suppose someone were to say to you, well, I'm pro-free speech, but hate speech is something else. I'm not in favor of curtailing people's speech, but I'm in favor of punishing people who commit hate through the mechanism of speech.
This is exactly why I'm against hate speech laws, full stop. Because the problem is, once you enact them, once they're on the statute books, it's impossible to define what they mean by that. I mean, there's a book by, I'm going to get this wrong, Paul Coleman, I think. It's called Censored, where most of the book is actually just a facsimile of the various hate speech laws throughout Europe. So you can see how every country defines it. And what is absolutely striking and clear is that no one knows how to define it.
Right.
Every single country defines it differently. UNESCO have made the point that it's impossible to define. We've recently had the Irish hate crime bill go through, and I think Helen McAteer even said that if we defined the word hate, the legislation would be useless. So now I'm saying that that's something I've been told on Twitter, so I would just caveat that, right? But if that's true, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the Scottish hate crime bill, for instance, has a similar thing, similarly draconian, where when that was instigated by Humza Yousaf, who was then Justice Secretary, he said that he wanted to criminalise hateful speech or speech that was intended to stir up hatred. That's the phrase that is used even within the confines of one's own home. He also had a section on the public performance of a play. He was asked about it in Holyrood, and he said, yes, I could envisage a situation where neo-Nazis would put on a play to stir up hatred. I can't envisage that situation, but maybe he knows more neo-Nazis than I do. I don't know any as it happens. So the reason why I'm against hate speech laws is if you have that, because I am for the notion of punishing people who break the law, right? So if you have a hate speech law in place, then I suppose theoretically I have to be in favour of trusting the courts and the judgment there. But I can still be critical of the law.
Well, where does your allegiance lie there if the government enacts a hate speech law?
Yeah.
And you've got these two competing notions. One is you don't think hate speech laws are legitimate, morally speaking, but another that if somebody commits a crime, they ought to be punished, otherwise the criminal justice system goes to bunk. What do you prioritise there in that situation?
I don't think you need to prioritise one or the other. I think what you can do is campaign to have a law repealed.
Or would you be in favour of the person being prosecuted if they had committed a crime against a hate speech law that you thought was morally legitimate?
I would make a big stink about it. I would say I think I disagree with this decision, and I'd say that it is a miscarriage of justice, and I would reserve my right to criticise, as I did in the case of the Marcus Meekin hate speech conviction, where he, the story about the Nazi pug.
That's Count Dankula,
That's
isn't it?
Count Dankula, right? So, but the point, and that's why I continually make a noise about that kind of thing, because I do want Section 127 of the Communications Act to be repealed.
But do you think it was right to fine him if he did actually break the law, even if you don't agree with the law?
In that case, no, because the prosecution failed to prove precisely what they claim they proved,
which was that he
deliberately intended
actually
to
stirring up hatred by. And for people who are unfamiliar, this was a man who made a video training his girlfriend's pug to do a Nazi salute.
I mean, when you say it's even funnier, it's because you say it so straight-faced. Because it's so silly, isn't it?
Yes.
He even explained the context at the start of the video. He said, my girlfriend is always going on about how cute and adorable her wee pug is, so I thought I'd turn it into the most awful thing I could imagine, which is a Nazi. So he's explained that the joke is predicated on the notion that there is nothing worse than a Nazi. In other words, it's an anti-Nazi joke. It's a joke at the expense of Nazis. But apparently, according to the Scottish government, you can't mock Nazis. They like to look out for them, apparently. So
in this case, they sort of trawled through his sort of internet history and all kinds of things to try and find out if he had any.
So that's the point.
Nazi tendencies.
Their cybercrime intelligence looked through every text he'd ever sent, every email, and by their own admission found absolutely no allegiance to any far-right group or any racist comments or anything. So by the prosecution's own conceding, they had no evidence. What the evidence they said was what the video in of itself. So in other words, it was their interpretation of the joke that was sufficient to see him prosecuted. So I think that is a miscarriage of justice. I don't think it even fulfills the criteria set out in the legislation.
Sure.
So that would be an example.
But in that case, of course, he doesn't fulfill the criteria. But suppose that he did.
Yeah.
You might still disagree with this law being in place.
Yes.
Do you think it would be right to fine somebody who breaks that law?
No, I think it'd be absolutely wrong. And I would say it was wrong. And if it were me, I would refuse to pay the fine. And if it were me, I would go to prison rather than concede that I'd done anything wrong.
Yes.
But I can't demand that of other people. Yeah.
Now, the main problem that you've identified with hate speech laws is the difficulty in determining what counts as hate.
Sure. Yeah.
The problem I see with this is that, and I've made the analogy before, again, to Constantine with copyright law.
Yeah.
Look at the cases of like Ed Sheeran being sued for his song that sounds a little bit like another song.
Was he? I didn't know about that.
Well, somebody tried to sue him. I think it was it was "Let's Get It On."
It's not a song I'm familiar with.
"Let's Get It On," as in that's Marvin Gaye's song. "Let's Get It On."
Okay.
And Ed Sheeran's "Thinking Out Loud," which sounds like a ridiculous comparison to make, but they do have the same chord progression and a similar beat.
So this is reminiscent of the Robin Thicke case.
Yeah, that's another example, the Robin Thicke case, and that was I can't remember the song that it sounded like.
No, neither can I.
But at any rate, these cases go to court.
Yeah.
And there's this big argument about, well, of course, if I just like re-recorded "Thinking Out Loud" by Ed Sheeran, then I'm breaking the law there. I've broken a copyright law. But what if I write something a little bit similar? What counts?
Yeah,
and the
so
difficulty is
difficult,
it's impossible to define. But because it's impossible to sort of draw a line about what counts as copyright infringement, and every country is going to have a different interpretation, I don't think that would be sufficient to say, therefore, copyright laws are illegitimate, and I wouldn't pay the fine in protest because I think this is a terrible law. Like,
but are you saying that is therefore an infringement on free speech? The fact that you cannot by law, simply record an Ed Sheeran song and release it.
The point that I made to Konstantin was that I think it's possible to conceive of it in that way, to say that copyright law is actually an infringement on free speech, but it's a legitimate one.
I don't think it is, though. I don't see how it is, because it is... The problem with what happened in that case, I assume, I don't know about that particular song, is taking someone else's work and passing it off as your own, as opposed to simply free expression. I think that it's a separate thing. It's like what I go back to with espionage and blackmail, etc. It's not. It's something that is adjacent to it, but is not quite the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's a deception, I suppose, within that. The deception, or I suppose you could say it's fraudulent.
Well, somebody could also do this, as it were, accidentally.
Yeah.
Especially in something like music or art. You know, you hear a song once, and you kind of, it's in the back of your mind somewhere. And when you're writing a song for yourself, this wonderful melody strikes you, and you kind of don't realize that it's actually come from somewhere else.
Happens all the time.
And then, so then this goes to court, and somebody says, "You stole my song," and it causes this great news item that it's so and such a huge debate, because nobody can quite determine what counts as copying and what doesn't.
It's so hard because in particularly music, there's a limited number of chords, there's a limited number of chord sequences, a limited number of notes. Chord sequences can't be copyrighted, of course, which is why there's that chord sequence that always gets you a number one hit.
Oh yeah,
it's the one that Black Eyed Peas used
yeah.
for "Where Is the Love," and Natalie Imbruglia used for "Torn,"
and it's "Let It Be." And
it recurs again and again and again. It's a nice sort of shortcut. But then when Bill Drummond, when the KLF started, and he was pioneering sampling, and ABBA took them to court, and they had to gather together all of their records and burn them, which they did in a pile, and they used that as the front cover image of their next album.
It's like, the song Bittersweet Symphony by The Verve. All of the royalties from that song go to the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, of course.
Because it sounds identical to an orchestral version of "This Could Be the Last Time" by the Rolling Stones.
But was that deliberate, do we think?
Well, if you listen to the... So it's a bit complicated, because you have the Rolling Stones song, and then there's this orchestral version which sounds quite different.
Yeah.
And then the Verve song sounds almost identical.
Yeah.
And there's a Joe Satriani has a song called "If I Could Fly," which Coldplay's "Viva La Vida" sounds very similar to.
I think that's inevitable.
Of course.
Wasn't John Lennon prosecuted? Not John Lennon. George Harrison was prosecuted for "My Sweet Lord," which someone said was a rip-off of another song. I think it's inevitable because of the nature of music that's going to happen from time to time. That's not the same as someone taking a sample and passing it off, as the Fugees did with Enya for their song "Ready or Not," and they took a sample from one of Enya's track called "Bodicea," and they didn't credit her. So you then found that on the singles they would write, "Oh, we're very grateful because she didn't sue." So that's not the same as if you accidentally hit upon the same melody as someone else. And like you say, these melodies are going through. We have these earworms all the time. I would hate to be a composer, because I'm pretty sure I would think, "Oh, that's a great song," and I'd write it down, and I've probably heard it many years ago. But the same happens in comedy, so it's very easy to reach a similar comedic conclusion on the basis of a news story as someone else. Now, I've had instances where I've seen a famous comedian on stage do a joke that I wrote, and but I've realized he hasn't stolen it from me. He's just reached the same conclusion, and that's the way it goes. And when that happens, I always drop the joke, because I'm not famous. So if I were to carry on, people would assume it was the other way around. On the other hand, I remember doing a set where an open mic act went on before me and did about 2 or 3 minutes of my set. And it couldn't have been accidental, because it was in the same sequence, even the same phraseology. And because I'm such a coward, I didn't say anything afterwards. All I did was just think, okay, well, I won't do that bit then, which is probably doesn't reflect well on me. But nevertheless, it can be the case, and I've seen it happen all the time. I did a joke at the Stand in Edinburgh once, or a set, and the head of the Stand came up to me after and said, "Oh, that's a bit like what this Irish comic does." It was a comic I'd never heard of, and so I just dropped it, because I just don't think it's worth it. But I think that's when it comes to artistic creation, it's inevitably going to be the case that you end up in the same point. I don't think it's a free speech issue unless it can be proven that you've gone out of your way to pass off someone else's work as your own.
But imagine from the position of a court here, in terms of who gets the money for this song,
right? And
they have to decide this. It makes sense that if somebody has clearly ripped off somebody else, and they're getting royalties from that song, that money should go to the original artist.
Yeah, sure.
Now, somebody could sit in the position of a legal theorist and say, but it's impossible to clearly define what counts as copying? I mean, there are levels to this. If you listen to some of the examples that I've spoken about, some of them are a bit similar, some of them are almost identical. And the analogy that I'm trying to draw is specifically to your point. This doesn't mean that hate speech laws are legitimate, but specifically to this rebuttal that, well, a problem with hate speech laws is that it's impossible to define what counts as hate.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of the case with any law? It's always impossible to precisely define
Can you
what
define
counts.
murder?
Well, I guess murder, I don't know what the actual legal definition is. It's probably something like the sort of intentional killing of a person not in self-defense or
it's what distinguishes it from manslaughter is the intent. Yeah.
Presumably, like, there are going to be cases where it's difficult to know exactly sort of what counts here. Like, were they acting in self-defense or were they not?
That's why we have a court system. That's why we have a judiciary. That's why we thrash this out in front of a jury.
So can't the same thing be said in cases where it's unclear whether something's hateful?
No, because
that's why we have a jury of peers to decide whether it was or not.
Because hate is too nebulous. It's not even in the same category. The idea of hate, what I perceive to be hate, I can guarantee will be different from what any other individual perceives to be hate. So there can be no shared definition of hate.
Is this a difference in degree or kind when talking about the difficulty with defining what counts as copying in copyright law?
Yeah.
And what counts as murder in murder cases, which I think this is a good continuum. Like, copyright probably sits somewhere in the middle in terms of being like quite nebulous, but a little bit easier to spot. Hate is
I think so.
much more difficult.
I think copyright has its own sort of tricky elements to it. I think it might be made easier, for instance, if you discovered an email from a musician to his friend saying, "I love this song, I'm going to rip it off."
Yeah.
Then it becomes an easier case.
Well, Ed Sheeran once, a few years ago, was doing his song Thinking Out Loud, and as part of the medley, broke into Let's Get It On.
Oh, right,
and sang it over the same chords.
That's
but
funny.
even that was a situation. Because it's interesting, you say there, well, look, if you had that, then that would make it more obvious. But even then, it's not clear because Ed Sheeran mixes up lots of different songs. And so that was his position in court as well.
That's almost a whole other discussion about the nature of art and the way in which artists borrow from each other, and which I don't think is a bad thing necessarily.
But are we talking about a continuum here?
But yeah. So let's go back to this point of
Or
hate.
is it like, the concept of a hate speech law is just like a categorically different kind of thing?
It just is. Because of it is like a miasma. I cannot define what hate means, really. I cannot define it. The people who write the legislation can't define it. And if what I've heard recently is true, the people implementing the legislation don't want to define it. So, it's quite obviously something that look, the law is continually being reinterpreted and tested, and it works on the basis of precedent. And the reason for that is that it can never be definitive. So all of these cases are ongoing in that respect, and our understanding of what these terms mean. But if you have legislation on the statute books that is, from the very outset, completely vague, to the extent that no one can tell you what any of it means, that is surely opening the pathway to tyranny. It's bound to be exploited by people who want to silence other people. But then there's a supplementary issue to that. Beyond the definitional issues of the term hate, there is the ethical issue of, should the state be auditing our emotions anyway? Why is it wrong to hate? Why shouldn't we be able to do so legally? That's another issue as well. So I think, and in a sense, that might be more pressing when it comes to my objection to hate speech. So I still want to reserve the right to hate if I want to. It's got nothing to do with the police.
Presumably when people talk about hate speech, although as you say, it's quite difficult to define, and sometimes there's a resistance to defining it perhaps for that reason, but when people talk about hate speech in the context of things they want to criminalize, I don't think they're just talking about an emotion of hatred towards something and that being police. I think they're talking about the expression of a hateful attitude with the intention of bringing about, upset or anger or misery in another person.
That's why they use the phrase stir up hatred in the legislation. That's why that recurs again and again. I think that's absolutely right. That's the defense that people use.
And what's the problem with this?
Well, the exploitative element. In the vast majority of cases, as you will have noted, when people complain about hate speech or report people for hate speech, they are doing so not because of what you just described, not because they have a fear of stirring up of hatred, but because they find something offensive. That has even been said explicitly. It's even been said explicitly by the police.
By the police,
The police who visited Harry Miller in that famous case, where they said, we need to check your thinking. They said, you have caused offense to someone. Or the recent case where they said, you have caused anxiety by posting a meme. So that is, I think, sufficient proof that it is open to exploitation.
Tell us about those two cases.
Okay, well, the Harry Miller one, I actually opened my book on free speech with that example because I thought it was so egregious, was that Harry Miller, who's a former police officer, by the way, the police contacted him because he'd retweeted a poem that was deemed to be transphobic by one member of the public. That member of the public complained, said, "I'm offended by this." The police visited him, and the phrase that the officer started lecturing him about gender identity for a start. Started sort of peddling all of this pseudoscience about people being born with half a brain, female, half a brain. Just absolute nonsense, which they'd obviously heard in some training session, probably orchestrated by the College of Policing. And then they used the phrase, "We need to check your thinking." Because he was saying, "Have I committed a crime?" They said, "No." And he said, "Well, if I haven't committed a crime, why are you here?" And they said, "We need to check your thinking." And of course, that's, if you were writing a play about a state descending into an Orwellian version of itself, that's the kind of phrase
that would be too on the nose, I think.
You wouldn't believe it, would you? Right. So that's why it became so well known. But also because this happens all the time. We know that between it was over a 5-year period up to 2022, there were over 120,000 recorded non-crime hate incidents by police in England and Wales. The Scottish police have a database of jokes that they've seen online. They don't tell the people that they're recording it. They just write down the name of the person who's said the joke, and they keep a watch on them. So all of these are non-crimes, right? Now, I've always made the case that the police have no business investigating non-crime. I don't think that requires any further justification than the statement in of itself, but I don't think they do. And in the case of Harry Miller, they sort of messed with the wrong guy because he is a former police officer himself. But he, of course, comes from a time before the College of Policing got its stranglehold over the police force. It's a quango. It's a group that is responsible for teaching the police how to be police effectively. And they were sort of ideologically captured probably about 12, 13 years ago. They introduced the notion of non-crime hate incidents, which do matter, by the way, because if I perceived that something you said to me today was motivated by homophobia, and I phoned the police and said that's my perception, according to the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines, they would have to record that. And the College of Policing guidelines, they would have to record that as a non-crime hate incident, irrespective of any malicious intent from you.
Because it's about the perception of the person who receives it.
Right. And then if you wanted to apply for a job teaching school kids, it would show up on a disclosure and barring service check, and you probably wouldn't get the job. So it does actually have consequences. It's not just that the police are recording these big long lists of people for wrongthink, which would be bad enough in of itself in terms of living in a liberal democracy, but there are the actual consequences that come about as a result of that. So that's what happened with Harry Miller, but then he took them to court. And this was a long, protracted back and forth over a couple of years. And because the College of Policing are so ideologically captured, they were resistant to any kind of criticism. So first you had Priti Patel, who was then Home Secretary, saying, "You've got to drop this. It's not in your remit to record non-crime." And they just ignored her. That's the Home Office. They just ignored it, right? Then the High Court comes down and says this is unlawful. And they ignored that. And then it happened again, and they said, well, we're going to fudge the language and we're going to come back again. And then the current Home Secretary says, you absolutely can't do this. And so eventually, by degrees, inchmeal, we're getting there by the College of Policing. But it's like trying to tell a group of high priests, you can't do your religious ritual anymore. You know, they are resistant to it because they believe they are on the side of the angels. This is why I compare it to a religion in the book. And therefore, it doesn't matter who you are. You can be the Home Secretary. You can be the highest court in the land, and they'll just ignore you. So that's what happened in the Harry Miller case, and I think it's very instructive, and I think it's an example of why we need to keep an eye on the cops, right? If they can't serve without fear or favour if they are partisan.
You don't just compare it to a religion; you call it a religion.
Yes.
What do you mean by this?
So,
and you're talking here about something like wokeism, social justice movements, political correctness, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think it is a religion. I'm using an analogy there. So to call it the religion of social justice is to be figurative. Okay. On the other hand, because, it doesn't have... I mean, I do make the point that there are religious movements that aren't necessarily supernatural in basis, that don't have a deity at the helm, right. Confucianism, etc.
Buddhism.
So that you could argue that that's not a necessary component of religious belief. Fair enough. I'm actually not delving into the weeds there. I'm using it as an analogy for the specific purpose that I want to make this movement accessible. The big problem with this movement is people don't know how to describe it because it describes itself in terms that are opposed to its intentions and objectives. So to give you an example, this is a movement that describes itself as progressive when I see it very clearly as regressive, and most people do. they describe themselves as liberal, the people behind this movement explicitly, in fact, say that they are opposed to liberalism. So to describe it as liberal is wrong even in their own terms. It's actually an anti-liberal movement. They talk about anti-racism, which is a doctrine that hyper-racializes society and increases racial division. You know, I wrote an article about The Spectator for this. I think I make the point in the book that really, in order to be opposed to racism, you have to be against anti-racism. And this sounds very, very confusing. And because the culture war is largely about language and is about people redefining terms whilst denying that they are doing so, people are baffled. They're really, really confused. And I wanted to write a book that made this movement comprehensible. I think that's really important because it succeeds largely, I think, on the basis of the good nature of the general public. Because if a movement comes along and says, hey, you know, we're for social justice, we're for equality, they actually use the word equity, but people hear equality, we're for, tackling racism. Well, who isn't, right? So, of course, there's going to be a lot of fellow travelers. But I think if people understood how the actual mechanisms of this movement and what it stands for, very few would support it. Because really it comes down to the conflict between liberalism, liberty and authority, which is what John Stuart Mill talks about in On Liberty. It's what George Orwell wrote about. This is a perennial debate. It's not about left and right. A good synonym for woke is anti-liberal. A good synonym for anti-woke is liberal. But of course, that's not the way that this has been largely comprehended in the general public. To call it a religion, therefore, does, I've noticed, have the effect. I mean, I started calling it that about 5 years ago. And I realized that it hit home immediately. People got it. They understand that there's a belief system here that has incredible clout, that enforces that clout largely on the basis of intimidation, but also from a kind of top-down authority. It says, you know, we have all the answers and you must follow our decrees. It punishes heresy. It excommunicates even those who step out of line. People can see all these parallels very, very clearly. Its presuppositions are largely faith-based. For instance, the idea that there are these power structures within society that undergird every situation, that racism is at the heart of any human interaction. The belief that we all have a gendered soul. So there are all these unevidenced presuppositions baked into the movement. And therefore, if you call it a religion, people get it. All of a sudden, it's like what Steven Weinberg said about, you know, in a world where you had good people and bad people, the good people would be doing good things, bad people would be doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, that takes religion. And then it makes sense. Wow, why do I see online all these people who have be kind and love wins in their bio threatening death and saying, we wish you would die in a grease fire. And, you know, I hope your children get diseased and perish of cancer. Well, how do you square that? You can suddenly square that when you see it as a religion. Suddenly, yeah, of course. They think they're doing God's work. They think they're completely in the right. And that by being this cruel and by demonizing people in this way, they are doing so in the way that the inquisitors of old, you know, could strap people to the rack and yet go home at night and say their prayers. It makes sense of it. Because otherwise, how do you make sense of the sheer cruelty of social justice activists? How do you make sense of that kind of legitimized bullying? Unless it's a belief system. You see, because I don't buy into this idea that they're all as horrible as they seem. I just don't. I kind of think that level of cruelty, for the most part, can only really come out of a sense that you were doing something for the good, I think.
But aren't you just sort of seeing the worst of it here? I mean, there's a lot to talk about in what you've just said. I mean, the faith-based aspect for a start. Do you think this is always faith-based? Do you not think there are any good arguments in favor of the sort of fundamental assumptions? I mean, I think the ones you mentioned were, you said something like racism at the basis of all human interactions, yes, or something like this. Now, I don't know if everybody who we might label as woke or as part of the new Puritans would say that racism is at the basis of every human interaction.
No, but the originators of critical race theory would.
The idea that it's always subtly there somewhere.
Yes, exactly. It's being. There's a couple of books that can be read on this. There's Delgado's book on critical race theory is a very good introduction. In fact, I think it's aimed at teenage readers. So it's not as though this stuff is inaccessible.
Is this like, in your view, complete hocus pocus, or is there
Well, I don't think
some legitimate? I mean, surely there are people who put forward arguments that this is the case. I mean, you described it as entirely faith-based, and faith is something like the belief in the absence of, or despite the absence of evidence.
Well, as you know, you can't prove a negative, right? So, for instance, this conversation we're having now, if I were to say to you, at the heart of this conversation is white supremacy being enacted, surely the burden of proof is on me right there, right? It has to be, right? And that's the problem with this movement. Now, critical race theory or a critical race theorist would say that society is organized by white people for the benefit of white people. It would say that I suppose I could use the way that Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay put it in their book Cynical Theories. The question that you ask is not did racism take place in this situation, but how did racism manifest in this situation? Now that to me is precisely what I've just described. That is someone making a claim. The burden of proof should be on them, but they disoblige themselves of providing that evidence because the theory takes care of it, if you will. Actually, your question about is there no merit within this? Well, there is. I mean, because the question at the heart of critical race theory is a good one. The question at the heart of it is, how can it be that we live in a society with equal legal protections for all ethnic groups and racism still lingers? That's really the question, because its origins are in law. The critical race theorists were legal scholars. Similarly with intersectionality. Intersectionality is another example. The fundamental premise is a good one. The idea that the way that Kimberly Crenshaw put it originally, she's the person who invented it, is that you can imagine an intersection like a road, and that you probably know this, and that there are people in the road who can be hit from different directions based on their multiple identity groups.
Yeah, the example she gives is black women trying to be. I think there was some kind of employment issue where there was some black women who thought they were not being hired on the basis of being black women, and this was sort of disproven in court by showing that the company hired black men and also hired white women.
Right, exactly. That was General Motors. And the idea is that
General Motors.
And they would basically be able to say, well, look, hey, we're not racist. We have loads of black guys at the office, and we're not sexist because we've got loads of white women. But of course, where are the black women?
That requires intersectionality.
She's right. And the good thing about that is she proved it. So you can see from the evidence she provided in that original article how black women fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Someone's made a claim and they provided evidence, and they're right. And so this is my point about now what intersectionality became. Is like a perverted religious version of it, something that doesn't really bear much of a resemblance to the original conception of intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw herself has complained, and she's right to complain, because it's not just, what she envisaged originally was not just a hierarchy of grievances, where you put people in these tallies, what has become colloquially known as the oppression Olympics. It's not what she was talking about, but that is the way it's often implemented now. So that's my trouble with it, is I think with all of these theories, I'm all for theorizing, and I love the sort of abstract conversations that you delight in, right? All of this stuff is great, but once you start applying these uncontested theories in the realm of public policy, even school policy or employment policy or whatever, that's a real problem. That's the equivalent to me of imposing religious dogma in these areas as well.
I saw a story in the Times yesterday. It was, I think the headline was, "The School with Extra Lessons for Black Pupils Only." Yeah. The message sent from the Inclusion and Anti-Racism Group to all Year 4 parents at Coldfull Primary School in North London invited, quote, black and black heritage children to join the 2-hour online sessions on Saturday mornings. White children were not invited. Apparently the aim was to accelerate the progress in reading and writing whilst also developing children's knowledge of black history and culture. Again, not offered to white students. And there was a response from one of the parents in the Times who said, why is this the case when it's actually white children who are falling behind? And it turns out that the school's own statistics and freedom of information requests, again, according to the Times, prove his point. In the final year, they show 7 times more white pupils than black pupils failed to reach the expected standard in national reading tests. 11 times more white pupils than black pupils fell short for writing at Coldfull. And yet there's a situation in which reading and writing extra classes are being offered only to black students and not to white students.
And that's the logical endpoint of applying critical race theory in the classroom.
Why does this kind of thing come about?
Because critical race theory can only exist with what they call praxis, with the actual application of its terms. the whole point of, since the sort of applied postmodernism era of the late 1980s, prior to that, you would have theorists talking about their theories, but no one was suggesting the implementation of these theories. And then the activists, stroke academics, decided they would be applied. And Helen Pluckrose actually dates this very specifically to 1989, because that is the year that most of these activist articles from academic sources came out. And you end up with this result where here we are now, 35 years down the line, and you have a school segregating kids effectively by skin color. Happened at the American school in London as well, where they segregated kids by skin color for after-school activities. This is the logical endpoint of this, what we could call misapplied critical race theory, if you like. But what they're saying there is that those kids have to be seen through the lens of their group identity first and foremost. And actually, the obvious point is, if you're going to offer extra classes for kids, offer it to the ones who are struggling, irrespective of their skin color. I mean, it's a kind of basic point.
But some may want to say that I mean, it's also written that it's progress in reading and writing whilst also developing the children's knowledge of black history and culture. So people might want to say, well, that's why it's aimed at black students rather than white students. But why can't white kids learn about it too, right?
It's incredibly racist.
Now, what I'm interested in hearing you try to do, given that you've written an entire book talking about this kind of stuff and these kinds of people promoting these kinds of ideas, is steel man it. Like, what is the position here? Not in the way that you would describe it, but we spoke a moment ago about sort of racism at the basis of all human interactions, even if we don't realize it. Society built by white people for white people. What is the strongest version of that argument? What is the strongest version?
Is that incontestably there's been a history of racism in this country, and it doesn't go back that long. I mean, when I was a kid, you would hear racist comments pretty commonly in a way that you just don't now anymore. We saw what happened with the Theresa May's hostile environment, with the Windrush generation. Those people were treated appallingly. Racism still lingers in society, and there is evidence for it.
But do you think, in the way you say, well, you wouldn't hear these kinds of racist statements these days? I agree with you that you'd probably hear it less explicitly, but do you think that that's because people are less racist, or do you think it's because the societal perception of racism has shifted, and now people who are still racist are just less willing to be so openly and in public?
I couldn't possibly say about the thoughts of people. I mean, the study. What I can say is that the studies repeatedly show that ours is probably the most tolerant country in the world racially, and is more tolerant than any country has ever been. Time after time, the polls come out. There was one recently, wasn't there? Where Britain comes up on top of Europe in terms of racial tolerance.
Yeah, I do hear that quite commonly pointed to, the idea that Britain is, the least racist country in the world. I mean, fine, but the sort of historical standard isn't particularly high, right? So this is what I was going to say, is that, well, firstly, I can't tell you whether the respondents to those polls are simply lying because they know that they should keep their racism secret. Frankly, even if that is the case, I think it's a positive thing, right? Because I think it's great that we've reached this kind of societal consensus that making racist statements is abhorrent. I don't want to hear them in public discourse. I believe in civility, and I don't. So that I think is a good thing. In a way, I don't care what people's private thoughts. In fact, I don't. But what I would say is, to your question of steel manning that point, yes, perhaps it could be argued that there has been neglect when it comes to the teaching of our history. I don't think, by the way, that the activists of today are helping this, because they are revisionists and often completely misrepresent history for political aims. So I don't really want them in charge of it either. I don't want them applying the specific context of Jim Crow and American slavery to Britain, as has happened again and again. I want people to learn about the history impartially, openly. This is what happened, warts and all. And that does include Britain's complicity in the slave trade. It also, of course, includes the Royal Navy's obliteration of the transatlantic slave trade over a period of more than 100 years. But all of these things have to be taught. So the best argument, I think, is there is a history of racism in this country. Although it is now a minority thing, it does still linger in certain areas. People from ethnic minority groups will, from time to time, face prejudice or will experience something. That's very, not, I can't say definitely, but it's likely to happen. And so therefore those things need to be addressed. That would be the best thing I could think of in terms of steel manning. The problem is racial segregation isn't the solution to that. And I sort of can't believe I have to say that. But yeah, there's something to be said for the idea that even if they're right, the solution that they've got on offer here is not the correct one.
And asking the questions is a good one. So for instance, why is it the case that children from Caribbean backgrounds underperform in schools and they perform much worse than white students? Why is that the case? there are, it's worth looking into that, isn't it? So that you can help those individuals. But then by the same token, if you then simply interpret that data as being to do with racism lingering in society, then you have to explain why people from African backgrounds outperform white students. Because if it is a form of racism built into the educational system, it's a particularly targeted form.
Yeah, quite. I wanted to pick up on something you said a moment ago, which is about this racism now being a minority position.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a moment ago you said that you can't know the thoughts of people, so it's difficult, I think, to say that with confidence.
It's not difficult to say that the polling data that I described, I mean, that's
oh, sure, but again, I mean, of course, people are not going to say that they're racist for two reasons. Firstly, if they are, they're likely to lie about it.
Yeah.
Secondly, because one of the arguments that we're talking about here is the idea that a lot of racial prejudice is essentially unregistered by people.
Yeah, I'm making the point that I cannot know people's private thoughts, but I would also make the point that it is unhelpful for me to presuppose the worst about the population. It doesn't get us anywhere.
No, but it might not be a presupposition, right? Somebody might say, look at this as a theoretical explanation of people's lived experience.
Yes.
Again, I know you've already spoken about why you don't like the idea of referring to lived experience, but in the case of Still Manning here, what the position actually is, somebody says, look, I have this theory that look at the way that people describe their experiences growing up, living through life, experiencing racial discrimination from people who ostensibly are not racist. And what they mean by that is that they're not going to go around saying that they believe in racial discrimination or something like this, but that they have some kind of implicit bias when it comes to hiring. I mean, it's been shown that if you take the names off of CVs, it changes who people are willing to hire because the names sound foreign, for example. Like, we know that this kind of stuff does exist. And if you took an employer and you found that they were much less likely to hire somebody if they had a foreign sounding name, but if they were anonymized, then they hired them equally. Yeah, somebody might want to say that man, it would perhaps be putting it too strongly to say, you're a racist.
Yes.
But to say that there is racism sort of at the basis of that particular interaction wouldn't be unfair.
You would have to prove it. I mean, I think you're right that it's...
But wouldn't that count as proof? That example of as soon as you make the names obvious, as soon as you de-anonymize the applications, the foreign-sounding names perform worse.
No,
would that not be evidence?
The stronger evidence for that, or the stronger explanation for that, is that people tend to favour candidates who are more similar to themselves, to the extent that if an applicant comes in with the same birthday, you are more likely to favour that applicant.
Is that true?
Yeah,
I didn't know that was the case.
So I mean, to say it is because of racism, it's a very, in a way, comforting solution because it's like it explains it.
Sure.
But there might be other factors there.
But
it might be, and there might certainly be implicit bias. And even if it is the case that someone is favouring candidates whose names are similar to their own or ethnically similar, then yes, that is an example, I suppose, of implicit bias on the ground along the lines of race.
Well, that's it. I was going to say the corollary of the position that actually what we're seeing here is people more likely to hire people like themselves.
Yeah, right.
But this is in so many ways why people think something like implicit racism exists.
So then you've got the question of, well, firstly, you have to acknowledge that implicit biases, like we have unconscious biases, we've got thousands of them, right?
Yes.
So we know that to be the case. What we also know, however, is that unconscious bias training never works and does nothing. In fact, if anything, it makes things worse, according to the studies.
Okay.
So therefore, then you add the liberal position, which is that actually employers have no right to be delving around in your mind anyway, in your secret thoughts. So all of these things would suggest to us that actually we've got to find a solution to what you've just described without simply taking a sledgehammer to it and saying, this is racism, this is something we need to cast out. And the solution, I think, in that case would quite obviously be anonymized applications, rather than demonizing the people involved. However, it could also be the case that the person processing the applications is a racist, right? But in order to make that claim, you'd have to have some evidence for it. And the scenario that you've described doesn't qualify there.
Well, I think it does in the sense that we'd need it to for this position to make sense, because again, this isn't somebody saying you are specifically a racist. Like there's something about you, like maybe you're sort of not a sexist, but you just have sort of a racial prejudice.
Yeah, but the idea is that everyone does. So I mean, if you were someone from an ethnic minority, you would maybe apply the same prejudice according to the names that come in onto the applications. It's just that we're in a white majority country, so it feels more pronounced the other way.
Sure, but isn't that basically the position that you're arguing against? The idea that, everybody has racial prejudices that are essentially unregistered a lot of the time by them. We live in a white majority country, therefore, our society is predominantly affected
I don't even know
by
if everyone has racial prejudices.
Anti-white racial prejudice.
I think everyone has unconscious biases. That's what I said. I don't. I'm not qualified to say whether everybody. I don't have insight to everybody's mind. But
it doesn't seem like the kind of like insane, crazy view that a lot of people might make it out to be. Like, it seems like a perfectly plausible worldview.
Yeah, it's perfectly plausible, and it's unhelpful.
But that is one of the. I mean, I agree with you that there might be sort of a problem of solution, because let's say we're just trying to diagnose here. Maybe we might decide that there is nothing we can do about this, but we're just making a theoretical observation that this is the case. This was one of the things that you gave me as an example when saying that, well, the reason I'm describing this as a religious movement is because it has these faith-based principles, like the idea that racism is at the basis of all social interactions. If it turns out this is actually a sort of a plausible theoretical outlook on the world, and sure, there might be problems with responding to that in the ways that people do, that seems to undermine at least one of the cases that you gave me to describe this movement as this sort of dogmatic religious movement.
Well, it's not a problem of plausibility, though. It's a problem of to what extent can you rectify that, and how helpful is it to do it? And furthermore, that the remedies that are being proffered, if they, as the evidence seems to suggest, hyper-racialize society, make society more racist, then really why implement them? What's the point? So it's all. I agree with you that having the theoretical conversation is great, and I'm all for that. Acknowledging the problem is also great, and trying to find the solution is also great. But implementing policy on the basis of wild theories that are unproven, which is, I think, what you're implying we should do, or not you, but suggesting it as a sort of devil's advocate thing, that just clearly is damaging. So I think it is very helpful to recognize the stronger points that the theorists are making. But once you start going along with their solutions, we are in a spiral to hell.
But we were talking about the religious element here. Is the religious dogmatic element then only in the way that people are trying to respond to perceived injustices?
No. I think to say that every human interaction is underpinned by racism is a faith-based position.
Despite
by its definition, because you haven't proven any of it.
Well, for example, when we spoke a moment ago again about these anonymized job applications, I said, well, this might be evidence of racial prejudice, and you said, well, no, that's just evidence that people sort of hire people who sound
I didn't
or
say
look
that.
a bit
I said
more like
that's
them.
that
seems to be evidence in favor of that proposition.
Yeah.
It might not be enough. Of course, that like this one example alone is not enough to establish the conclusion that like everybody's racist, but it seems to be evidence that counts in favor of this proposition that people have racial prejudices that they might not even be aware of. And if you have enough of those kinds of evidences,
but you don't. I mean, that's a singular example that has proven something that we all know to be true anyway.
So if it were true that something like what these people claim is the case,
every human interaction,
every human is somehow tainted by racism, or we could even take a weaker claim that every interracial interaction that people have. So anytime a white person and a non-white person interact, there is racism present.
Yes.
What would you expect to see? Well, what would you expect that world to look like? What kind of evidences do you think would manifest that we could look
like
at?
The UK looked 50 years ago. I think that at the time of the Windrush generation, I mean, those people faced racism on a daily basis. It was the kind of society where racism was normalized.
But if the thesis is that the racial prejudice we're talking about here is implicit and unrecognized.
Oh, well, that's a different thing. You see, but that's the argument they make because they say that because we have taken such strides in terms of legislation, equality legislation, and that kind of thing, that what has happened effectively is that those racist impulses have been subsumed into society.
And if that is the case,
so that you can't see them anymore.
What evidence would you expect to find in a society like that?
Well, that's my point. Is that needs to be proven from the people making the claim, right?
Yeah.
So when Robin DiAngelo says that today's racism is worse than Jim Crow, because we can't see it, and you need a special degree to detect it, right? She's putting herself in the position of a high priest there, saying, I've got I can see your aura, and other people can't. That requires there has to be some kind of evidential threshold there. We can't just take that on trust that what this woman says is true. I need to see some evidence.
Well, what kinds of evidence do you think would sway you in that direction?
Oh, I'm always swayed by evidence of racism. If there's, that.
But how? The problem is, if it is, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's easy enough to say if people are overt racists,
Yeah.
then we can look at the evidence of that and we can prove it.
Yes.
But the claim that's being made here that we've got implicit racial prejudices that are hard to recognize even by the person who possesses them.
Yes.
And you're like, well, show me the evidence. What if it's the kind of thing that is
That there can
true,
be no evidence for.
or that the kind of evidence is always going to be a little bit murky, or it's going to be something in the form of something like lived experience, which we're obviously never going to be able to have access to.
In a liberal society, you obviously can't do anything with it. I mean, I would say to you, for instance, let's give an analogy. If I say that I detect in you a virulent homophobia, and therefore you shouldn't be employed, and I want to enact that, I want that to actually be enacted, and you say to me, but you surely that's going to affect my life, I need some evidence, and I say, no, I've made that decision, now it has to be done. You wouldn't be happy with that being enacted in real life, and it's just an equivalent thing. Now, it might be true, you might be a rabid homophobe, but I can't simply make that claim and change your life and change society on the basis of an evidence claim, and we all know this to be true. And I think that's a given. I don't think society can operate on theories applied on intuition.
Who do you find to be the most compelling on the other side, as it were, in terms of writers or speakers or authors that argue in favour of these kinds of positions?
It's so difficult because they never talk. They never debate.
In terms of their writings, their books that you must have studied
Ibram X.
quite a
Kendi
lot.
is the better writer, as in his book on how to be an anti-racist is a readable book, and partly that's because he focuses so much on personal anecdotes, which are very interesting. It's when he starts getting into these sort of assertions that he makes about anti-racism. You know that there's a dichotomy of the dichotomy of not racist and racist is false, that sort of thing, which leads to the point where other theorists like Alana Lentin will say that to be not racist is a form of racist violence. I think she describes it as discursive racist violence because you have to be proactive in the discovery of racism. Look, that sort of stuff is nonsense. It's a readable book because he focuses on him as a human being, and I'm interested in human beings.
Was there any point during the sort of research for your book, reading the materials that you wish to oppose, where you have a sort of a pause and think, you know what?
Always. Always.
There might be a kernel of truth in this.
Yeah, of course. Happens all the time. So, and even in Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, there's every now and then I come across, I think, oh, that's a good point. I usually mark it in the margin because it doesn't happen very often.
Can you think of any examples? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I'd have to have my copy with me.
I just wonder what kind of, I mean, we spoke earlier a little bit about
the reason
what legitimacy there might be.
Well, the reason is
this,
because they're coming
movement.
from the same place as me. Really, like the point is that both me and Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and all these people would like racism to be eliminated from society. And given that we're all coming from that position, we're bound to have points of agreement. White Fragility is a terrible book. It is entertaining for the wrong reasons. It is, but there are, even within that book, glimpses. I mean, look, the central premise have you read White Fragility?
I actually haven't, no.
The central premise, I don't think I'm being unfair in categorizing it in this way, is that all white people are racist, and those who deny the accusation of racism are displaying what she calls white fragility, which is proof of racism. So this is the Kafka trap. This is, if someone denies they're a witch, that's evidence of witchcraft, right? Anyone in the realm of thought and philosophy, and you will know that we can reject that outright. The book is also quite badly written. The other thing that she does continually is she talks about her own racism. She talks about it quite openly. I'm not being libelous. She says that she has racist thoughts. But the mistake she then makes is to say, and this is an example of how white people think about black people. And an example of that is where she describes, in the book, she describes going to a street party, and she says she sees there's a predominantly black party on one side of the road and a predominantly white party on the other side, and she's seized with a panic. What if I've been invited to the black party? I would hate that. And then she's like, oh, that's because I'm a white person and I'm racist. And you see, this is the way white people react when they're surrounded by black people. It's like, well, I wouldn't have. Speak for yourself. Like this, and so she, and I'm not going to do any kind of cod psychology, but there is a sense in which she absolves herself of her racist thoughts by saying everyone has it. Yeah. Or that's what definitely comes across. But anyway, in terms of your question about who do I admire, like I said, I can read Ibram X. Kendi. Yasmin Alibi Brown I find very readable, and I think she's a nice person in conversations I've had with her. Although we fundamentally disagree on basically everything. Who else is who I think is quite good? I can name a lot of the ones that are very bad. That's not really what you want, is it?
That was, in fact, the exact opposite of what I asked for.
So the problem with this literature, and I spend more time reading it than I do stuff I agree with, is that it blends into one. People start speaking in slogans and almost like as substitutes for thought. They have the same mantras, shibboleths, recur again and again, so that they almost become interchangeable. And there's some passages in Robert DiAngelo. I'm like, am I reading Laurie Penny here? Like it's that kind of, and so therefore there's a blandness to that. I mean, I had someone tweet at me today, "Trans rights are human rights." I don't know why. I don't know who this person is. That's just a slogan. It's a mindless slogan. And when people are speaking like that, they're not thinking for themselves. And I don't know what she was saying to me there. Because I think everyone should have equal rights, irrespective of who they are, whether they're trans or not trans or whatever. And I've never said anything differently. But because they're not thinking in those terms, I mean, a lot of these people appear to be anyway, dividing humanity into good and evil, those on the right side of history and the wrong side of history, to use the phrase that they like, and deploying these what Lifton called thought-terminating cliches. Just trans women are women, trans rights are human rights, etc. And just putting them out there and throwing them towards the people that they recognize as being on the wrong side of this, the evil people. And that's why it disturbs me when I read the books, and I continually get the sense of someone almost adhering to a program, of someone reciting from a script. And that's why whenever I do come across a good point, I mark it and I write it down. I've even quoted some of them in the books. I think I've quoted approvingly. I can't remember a few of them, and I do so because I want to be fair to them as well. But I would love the opportunity to sit and talk, because I think when you sit and talk to people, you actually get beyond the slogans. You actually get to the point where people have to defend their positions and have to explain to you what they mean. And that's much more fruitful. The problem is that at the heart of this movement is the postmodernist belief that our understanding of reality is constructed wholly through language, and that therefore even to platform or to enable that discussion, to even hear the other side of the argument is detrimental to society, because it drags us all down. So that's why there's that book, Is Free Speech Racist? I think it's Gavin Titley wrote that. He makes that case as well, that effectively, that, by the way, is not fair. I don't think the title is a fair representation of what the book is. But nevertheless, the idea of enabling certain... it goes back to what you were talking about before about hate speech. The theory behind a lot of this appears to be that ideas, as expressed through language, are like toxins. And if they are unleashed on society, they poison us all. That seems to be the idea. That, again, I would add, as an unevidenced faith-based claim, by the way. That particular view, in fact, particularly so because for all the activist claims that we need to cut out scenes from films, we need to rewrite P.G. Wodehouse, we need to rewrite Agatha Christie, etc., because we need to republish Huckleberry Finn without the racial epithets, because if those words are out there, it makes society more racist, is flatly contradicted by all the evidence, by all the 6 decades of research into media effects theory. So not only is it a faith-based assertion, it's one that is contradicted by all of the studies that have gone into this.
You said to our mutual friend Chris Williamson on a podcast that you did with him...
Is this going to be a gotcha?
I hope not. The problem isn't the activists. The problem is capitulation to the activists.
Yes.
Do you remember what you meant by that?
I think it goes back to what I was talking about to you earlier with Salem, in that I don't begrudge people who are behind a cause, who sincerely believe in their cause and want to change society for the good as they see it. I think that's quite a noble thing. The problem is that they are so wrong-headed in their approach, and because I don't like bullies fundamentally, I really don't, and also because I believe in liberal values and I see those as being under threat, and they are a direct threat because they are, as I say, anti-liberal, quite fundamentally authoritarian. That I feel I have to, but I don't think they're the problem, as I say, because I think we can work around them, I don't think schools and governments, etc., should be implementing the ideas of the shrillest and most unreasonable factions of society, particularly when they are a very small minority of society.
What do you make of Just Stop Oil as a movement?
Well, I'm struck by how posh they all are. I mean, that always makes me laugh. Well, I always find it funny when people who are incredibly privileged start berating other people about privilege. That to me is just quite funny. And I just wish, like, one time when one of these activists comes onto a TV show to talk, they didn't sound like a P.G. Woodhouse caricature. It'd be great. I mean, they have names like Sage Willoughby and Mike Ponsford. I mean, it is like I write characters like that, and I give them names like that, right? So, I mean, look, that's just ad hominem, I know. However, or is it? There's an interesting correlation between social justice activism and eco-activism, between that and financial privilege. There's a really interesting correlation there. There's an interesting correlation in the rapidity with which critical race theory and queer theory is coming into the poshest schools first. Similarly with universities, the ones in the Russell Group, the ones in the Ivy League, they seem to be more susceptible to the critical social justice movement. Perhaps it's because the critical social justice movement is quite antagonistic towards the working class people, and is, in a sense, this is why I say I don't believe it's a left-wing movement in any authentic sense, even though it describes itself as such.
You describe yourself as left-wing?
It does describe itself as
yeah. You describe yourself as left-wing?
Yes. I mean, I would say if your definition of left-wing is the traditional definition of left-wing, then yes, I would be left-wing.
Are we in need of just abandoning?
I'm sorry, I've steered you away from the Just Stop Oil already, but I should just add to that, by the way, that I don't know enough about them.
Well, I wonder, because we've got a movement here of people who, I think a lot of people's gripe with Just Stop Oil is not so much that they're blocking the roads, but that the police are sort of not doing anything about it. And it reminded me of the way you're talking about your problem not so much being with people who genuinely believe in a cause that they think is right, and
I understand.
Others who just as you say, capitulate.
No, absolutely. I totally get the comparison you're making there, because yes, you're right. I think you need to apply the law, right? And there's a real danger of the police not dealing with these activists in the way that they should, because now you have the Tory government pushing through all kinds of draconian anti-protest measures, including the crime sentencing bill.
Yeah.
The policing crime and sentencing bill, or the recent one they tried to smuggle through when the House of Lords pushed it back. The one they did just a couple of days before the coronation, like all of this sort of stuff. It's like, we have to have the right to free protest, which will be inconvenient to some people. It's really important that we sustain that right. And so when the police allow activists to commit acts of vandalism, criminal acts, and do nothing about it, then that gives a kind of justification for the government to push through draconian measures. So I wish they wouldn't do that, because I think for the preservation of all our liberties, just apply the law. And that doesn't mean that the activists can't be loud and annoying, because I think they should be.
That's what
right?
Activism in many ways
That's
is
the
about.
point.
Yeah.
But I think when they break the law, apply the law. And then we wouldn't have this problem of a Tory government that keeps wanting to suppress our liberties. But you were going on to the point about...
Left, right. Is this sort of an idea we need to abandon? Because I've seen so much confusion over this, and I constantly hear the phrase, sort of, somebody says something like, "Well, look, I'm from the left, but..."
That's because everything appears to have been reduced in these Manichean terms to good versus evil. As I was describing earlier, I think that's the way that the world is now perceived. So that the slightest point of political disagreement is interpreted as evidence that you're on the wrong side, that you're kind of one of the evil ones. It's a very simplistic, Disneyfied understanding of the world. And it just so happens that this notion has been transposed onto the concepts of left and right, this hangover from the French Revolution, which I probably think has been killed off by the culture war ultimately. And the reason I think that is because I don't think you can make a coherent argument that the critical social justice movement is left-wing for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I say, it appears to be hostile and mistrustful of the working class. It appears to think that they're all racists in waiting, just waiting to hit, if they go and see a comedian who tells certain jokes or watch a film, that they'll all go out and commit racial pogroms or something, right? There's this active kind of, when they talk about intersectionality, too often they leave off class and nepotism and money. They appear to have no interest in redressing economic inequality, perhaps because, as I say, most of them have double-barreled names and the system seems to work in their favour, who knows? But so there's all of that. On top of that, this is now embedded in all major multi-billion-dollar corporations. It's a movement that sides with the CEOs over the workers. Whenever there's this kind of conflict between, people getting fired for unconscious bias or whatever it might be, it sides with the CEOs. It goes back to, I think, that year, 2016, where you had Brexit and Trump at the same time. And I think, from what I can see, I don't know, but it looks very much to me that that's when everyone went a bit crazy. And this notion of a good versus evil world became fermented. I mean, that's when I started to that's when I started to notice it. Because all of a sudden, all of my friends back then were left-wing Labour voters. None of them had ever expressed any interest in the EU. None of them knew how it worked, how it operated. They couldn't name someone on the Commission. They didn't know what the Commission did. And all of a sudden, they're painting their faces in EU flag. It became like a tribal symbol. And because I voted Leave, I was considered some kind of pariah. I had an old comedian friend of mine saying, but I thought you were intelligent. It was suddenly you're either on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, similarly with Donald Trump. And all of this sort of happened. And within that, there's the added problem that I think it's incoherent to be in favour of the EU, an international trading bloc that has capitalism at the heart of its constitution, and call yourself left-wing. It's actually incoherent, right? So everything has been divided and shattered, and it might just be that 2016 was the year that left and right became redundant, because now I hear the kind of values that I espouse as being far right. So when I talk about free speech, that's now bracketed within the right-wing, far right idea. If that's the case, if traditional liberal values are now suddenly far right, then maybe the concept of right and left has no further utility at this point.
Yeah, especially because you might want to say that they've swapped. We've got a situation where free speech, which is traditionally a left-wing issue, now is seen by many as a right-wing issue.
But it should be non-partisan, shouldn't it? I mean,
sure, but I mean, I think it's fair to say that free speech has traditionally been a left-wing.
Depends who you talk to. And certainly not Stalin. I think.
Yeah, I guess was Stalin left-wing? I think.
Those who call themselves communists now will tell you that they're left-wing.
Yeah, but also, I mean, you write in the book that the rise of the new Puritans and the success of their culture war has effectively sabotaged the class struggle of the traditional left. You brought to my attention, actually, reading this book, I noticed, as you said it, that for all of this talk about justice, I mean, people do talk about poverty and class, but it always seems like a bit of an add-on. It doesn't seem to be at the center, whereas a class used to really be the defining factor of right and left-wing politics.
Right, exactly.
The left wing of politics was about the economically disadvantaged, and now, if anything, that might seem to have swapped. But in the way that, like, we describe traditionally left-wing ideas as being seen as right, or as you say, free speech being seen as like far right, which I don't think is always the case, but I know what you mean. It's not like the same's happened in reverse. It's not like traditionally right-wing notions are now seen as left-wing.
It's
something weird has happened where the words just seem to have fallen out of favor.
Then it comes back to this moral purity idea, doesn't it? Because it's only shifting in one direction. Colin Wright did that illustration that became well known when Elon Musk retweeted it, of a stick man on a sort of political spectrum, and suddenly the whole thing has shifted and he's on the far right all of a sudden.
Right.
He starts out on the left. You know the one I mean?
Yeah, I'm sure I've seen it.
Became a well-known meme.
Yeah.
And that it does appear that has happened. I find it very distressing. And you're right, and particularly the attacks on the working class. I mean, even the notion of white privilege, for instance. I mean, there's evidence to suggest that has negatively affected working class people, because it's muddied policy thinking, because you start thinking, well, if there's a poor white kid who's on the poverty line, he doesn't matter so much because he's got this privilege, this thing. None of this.
That's something you talk about. I know, because people will listen to that and be like, what are you talking about? But like you say that there's evidence for this.
One thing I do in the book, which I think you can't accuse me of missing out, is I do extensively footnote this.
Yes.
And
it's well cited.
Because I wanted to be sure that you couldn't come back and say, you're making all this up. Because that seems to be the standard approach, is to deny.
Right.
So every reference can be chased.
Stephen Burnell, who's a streamer called Destiny on I think he's mainly on YouTube now, he made the point, I think it was him, that it's not about left and right so much anymore in terms of defining people's political allegiances, but about, I think he used the terms establishment, pro-establishment and anti-establishment.
Sure.
For him, that has sort of become the new defining divide. I'm wondering, presumably you don't think that good and evil are actually a good descriptor of the divide between people, but there is something that divides them. What do you think it is? If it's not left and right anymore, is it something like establishment, anti-establishment? Is
So
it something
good
else?
and evil, I think, are theological terms, really, and I don't think they're useful because they're useful in terms of struggles within individuals, within the heart of every human, as Solzhenitsyn says. You know that the line of good and evil cuts through the heart. It's useful when you're talking about Shakespeare, where all of his principal characters are struggling with good and evil. There are interior struggles, which are then well, let's not get onto that. But although I think that's fascinating, I think establishment and anti-establishment comes with its own stack of problems. Insofar as one of the reasons why people claim that I am on the right is because I am focusing on culture war issues which they say, why are you focusing on all of this when the Tories are in power, when there's a right-wing government, and that means that the establishment is seen as connected to right-wing politics, right? So then you have to talk about what you mean by the establishment. You see, I think the woke, or whatever you want to call them, are the establishment because they have so much clout within our major institutions, because you can't vote them out. They're there in the Tory party and the Labour Party. In fact, the Tory party has presided over all of this over the last 12
Well,
years.
this is the interesting thing, is that people will want to listen to what you're saying and say, okay, you're talking about the political clout of woke culture, but we've got a conservative
Exactly, and that's the mistake they
government.
make. We saw Ben Bradshaw the other day. I tweeted about this because I'm sure he's a lovely human being. I'm not having a go at him, but he makes a very common error, which is that he described it as the Tories' culture war. The Tories have presided over all of these cultural shifts and done nothing to prevent them. They've enabled them. Now, I'm not saying Labour would be any better. In fact, I know they would be a whole lot worse. But the point is, if you vote Labour, if you vote Tory, you still get the identitarians. You can't get rid of them. They're too firmly embedded in the civil service, in the machinery of government. They're too firmly embedded in all the NGOs and the quangos, right? So in the NHS, in the army, in the police, could go on. So you can't get, so that's where establishment power seems to me to lie. However, when you deploy terms like establishment and anti-establishment, people are going to say or think that you're talking about the government that's in power and the party that is not in power, or something along those lines. That's why I don't think it's helpful, because what I found in writing the book as well, is part of the reason I wanted to write the book is to define all of the terms, right? So that people understand who I'm talking about. And even a term like woke, I mean, I've got a full chapter on this.
Yeah.
The term woke was used by the activists to describe themselves. Then they do their revisionist trick of saying we never use that term to describe ourselves. It was a snarl word invented by the right. Now some of them are reclaiming the word again, etc. But what they do is that when you get a term that is a successful shorthand to describe what it is they're about, they problematize the shorthand and blame you for applying it, which means that you can't defeat an enemy if you can't name the enemy. It's that idea. So when we talk about establishment and anti-establishment, if I were to then start talking in those terms, I'd probably have to write another book explaining precisely what I mean by establishment and anti-establishment. So what might be more helpful, I feel, is the dichotomy of liberty and authority that I go back to earlier, that Mill talks so eloquently about. Because that, I think, is something that is difficult to problematize. I think we all understand what we mean by that. Liberals come from the left and the right. There are libertarians who are liberals. There are, liberal values are great because they are they cross those lines of left and right. They transcend it. And so, and they are values that we can point to the last 60 years of progress in civil liberties and say it works, you know? And so that's why I think, forget about left and right. I'll call myself a liberal now, because that's the only way because it's accurate, but it's also comprehensible. And I think if we start talking in terms of the culture war, less about left and right, because it's incoherent, because there are woke people on the left and the right and anti-woke people on the left and the right. So what does it mean? Let's talk about those who value liberty against those who value authoritarianism. And because there appears to be, throughout history and literature, a kind of enduring appeal, there's something about the human spirit that inclines us towards authoritarianism, something we have to guard against. Because of that, it's something that's never going to go away. But also because of that, the best remedy for it is the ongoing process of social liberalism, which by its own admission is not a utopian thing. It recognizes the imperfectibility of humankind and society. It's not saying, the critical race theorists explicitly say, because we haven't reached a society where racism has been eradicated, that points to the failure of liberalism or proves that liberalism does not work. But it's quite the opposite, because liberalism recognizes itself as this ongoing project. And it does make huge gains, and it does work. And I think that's where to me, I mean, if people to get any takeaway from the book, I think to me, that's the most useful way to understand what we've now called the culture war. That dichotomy there, liberty and authority, rather than establishment and anti-establishment, left and right, even woke and anti-woke, because that too has become too muddied with multiple meanings.
Well, the book is The New Puritans. I'll make sure that it is linked in the description and show notes for those who are listening. Andrew Doyle, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you can watch more full episodes of Within Reason by clicking the link on your screen, or subscribe by clicking just below it. Within Reason is also on platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget, you can get a premium subscription to Atlas VPN by going to get.atlasvpn.com/Alex. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.